The Sturmabteilung, or SA for short, have become one of the most iconic parts of Third Reich history. Hitler's brown shirts are always mentioned, and everyone knows that they were some kind of paramilitary group. People know the name Ernst Röhm, and that he was killed on the night of the Long Knives. But how much do people actually know about the SA? Why were they founded? What did they do? Who even was Ernst Röhm? What became of the SA after that bloody night in 1934? I will attempt to answer all of these questions and more in this video. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. This video is purely historical and in no way political. Anything related to Germany at this time is a controversial topic, but I urge you not to overthink this video and to just take it as it is, a history video. Nothing more. Thank you. Also, to help with today's video, Antelope Hill Publishing have kindly sent me some books. Conquering Berlin by Wilfried Bade was an extremely helpful insight into how the SA men themselves saw their struggle to turn Berlin from a hotbed of communism and leftist political violence into the capital of the Third Reich. In his own words, The Essential Speeches of Adolf Hitler by C.J. Miller was extremely helpful, as it is quite literally Hitler in his own words, which is rare. The speeches in the 1920s and the context added by Miller beforehand really helped with the topic of the SA, and goes a long way to explain how Hitler himself saw the movement and the world at large at the time. Apart from these books, Antelope Hill has a gigantic collection, specialising in books which would otherwise be decades out of print. So in a sense, they're keeping history alive, and you won't find their works anywhere else without paying a fortune. I've had a few approaches to sponsor videos lately, but I made the decision only to share things with you guys that I use myself or find helpful. Antelope Hill is one of these, and it's a one-of-a-kind publishing house. They've also kindly given me a 10% discount code for you all to use, ZH10, and I'll link their website in the description. Thanks to their incredible material, I'll also be able to make several other videos in the near future, which I otherwise wouldn't have been able to make without their help. And finally, as always, a huge thank you to my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube members who make these videos possible. Without their kind support, I simply wouldn't be able to make these videos for a living, and I cannot thank you all enough. If you do want to support the channel, join our Discord, or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, then please do consider signing up on one of the links in the description. Thank you. Before there was the Sturmabteilung, there was the Freikorps. In 1918, the German Empire accepted peace on the basis of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, but were quickly disappointed. The Allies didn't even attempt to abide by the points, and instead, Germany was essentially condemned to financial slavery for the next century. During the peace negotiations, in which Germany wasn't invited, the Royal Navy continued its starvation blockade. Safe to say, things weren't all well at home. Whilst the troops had been at the front in France, there had been a number of left-wing uprisings back in the fatherland. As the endless waves of troops began to flow back into Germany, many simply didn't demobilise. How could they? Germany was in complete disarray. In Hitler's state of Bavaria, for example, an anti-war socialist movement named the Independent Social Democrats marched on King Ludwig's palace and took power. C.J. Miller describes their leader, Kurt Eisner, quote, Kurt Eisner was an eccentric, a black-bearded bohemian, a drama critic, and a utopian, with no formal administrative experience. His disavowal of Russian Bolshevik violence and extremism, and his insistence on peaceful parliamentary methods, made him unpopular with the left wing of his party, and with the communists of the KDP, while his utopianism, perceived incompetence to govern, role in inciting a munitions worker strike during the war, and acknowledgement of German war guilt drew hatred from the right. The new government, largely inexperienced and saddled with pre-existing social and economic problems, was unable to function smoothly or provide basic services, end quote. It is also worth noting that Eisner was Jewish, which further made him seem like the stereotypical stab-in-the-back character often mentioned by Hitler. It's safe to say, this state of affairs didn't last long. In February 1919, he was shot dead by a right-winger. In April, a Bavarian Soviet Republic was proclaimed by far more passionate, although incompetent, communists. They were a group of intellectuals with no experience. Their leader was Ernst Toller, who was also Jewish, and quickly attracted the ire of the right, whom were increasingly laying the blame at the feet of the Jews on the home front for their loss in the war. Under this very short-lived regime, history was banned from universities for being, quote, hostile to civilization. A plan was set up to collectivize the Bavarian farms, but they never got the chance. Within weeks, they were taken over by the actual Communist Party, and a professional revolutionary named Eugene Levine took charge. Eugen was again Jewish, and this trend gave endless ammo to theories that would inspire men like Hitler in just a matter of months. In fact, Eugen wasn't even German, he was Russian, which further added ammo to the supposed international Jewish communist plot. Levine, with the personal blessing of Lenin, began to implement radical social and economic reforms. Quote, factories were placed directly under the control of workers' councils. Luxurious apartments were seized and used for government headquarters or to house the homeless. A church was occupied and converted into a revolutionary temple devoted to the goddess of reason, echoing Robespierre, and Levine planned to abolish paper money. Even more worrying, aristocratic and wealthy bourgeois civilians were taken hostage in case of reactionary retaliation, and a proclamation was issued that Bavaria was to act as the vanguard for the Bolshevization of Europe, end quote. They had taken things too far. The fiercely Catholic Bavarians were having none of this nonsense. Everyone wanted this nightmare to end, and the shortages were becoming endemic. Elsewhere in the country, bands of men had taken up arms to resist these types of events. Communist violence was brutal and seemingly random. The nation was in disarray. The police was no match for the hordes of revolutionaries. There was seemingly only one option to rescue Germany from communist hell. The president of Germany, anything but a right-winger, was left with no choice. He made what he viewed as a deal with the devil. It was only them who could save Bavaria. In late April, these bands of veterans from the Great War surrounded the city, ready to move in. Among the ranks of these men were Ernst Röhm and Rudolf Hess. The communists were the embodiment of everything they felt that had led to their defeat on the home front. This was never going to be a clean job if they had to use force. The government and Freikorps alike dropped leaflets into the city by plane, urging the revolutionaries to lay down their arms. Many did, but this wasn't enough to break them. When they learnt that the city was surrounded, they began executing hostages. At this point, the Freikorps could no longer be held back, and they moved in on the 1st of May. The fighting was as bitter as expected, but entirely one-sided. The communists fought to the end, but they were no match for the well-motivated Freikorps, whom shot, stabbed, and even burned their way through the centre of the city with flamethrowers. Hundreds were executed in the following days. In the eyes of the locals, Bavaria was saved. It had been an easy, yet brutal, victory. On the 6th, however, the Freikorps showed how unruly they could be. In a drunken mess, a bunch of Freikorps men, hungry for a fight, murdered 21 innocent civilians on a false rumour that they were revolutionaries. They were actually members of the St. Joseph Society, a Catholic workers' club. The Freikorps were then forced to leave the city in shame. Most of the communist revolutionaries, for their part, were spared the immediate executions, but were ultimately sentenced to death or lengthy prison sentences. Levine tried to flee, but was caught, and a huge, overjoyed crowd of locals appeared to witness his death sentence. Following this, Bavaria reverted to its former self and began to reflect its citizens once more, Catholic and conservative. The new leadership would be conservative military types. The Freikorps, despite their unruliness, would continue to act as the one and only force that could be relied on to save Germany when she needed bailing out from the communists or other outside forces like on the Polish border. Thousands joined the ranks of these various bands in order to protect Germany, or just to get away from the monotony of the miserable everyday life that now existed for most in Germany. Jean-Denis Lepage describes these men at length. Quote, members of the Freikorps were volunteers, very often ex-servicemen, former officers, adventurers and the unemployed, students and youngsters eager to prove their valour. Some of them were fanatical nationalists, and many were men who liked to wear a uniform and felt at home in barracks. Indeed, men who never settled down to the monotonous routine of civilian life. Besides, unemployment was rife, and many professional soldiers did not wish to exchange the prestige of a Freikorps unit for the misery and shame of civilian unemployment. The officers, of course, would find such a fall even worse. The image of the First World War as a period of almost unrelieved horror, which later developed in Europe, was not shared by all the soldiers themselves when they returned to the post-war civilian world. For many of them, this was disappointing and drab, and for some a real deprivation. In many countries, the terrible experiences of the war did produce a deep and widespread reaction against militarism, but pacifism was by no means universal. At post-war regimental reunions, veterans maintained their strong wartime comradeship and were able to persuade themselves that the war, with its warm fellowship and its dangerous adventures, its inhuman sufferings and petty pleasures, its challenges and triumphs, its economic security and freedom from domestic responsibilities, had really been the happiest time of their lives. This nostalgia for a lost world of security, status, and purpose was a significant element in the confused political movements which gave birth to various forms of populism and fascism in the 1920s and 1930s. End quote. This isn't a Freikorps video, and they're worthy of a video of their own, but what's important here is that these are men who would end up mostly becoming involved in groups like the SA. In 1921, after the completely botched Kapp Putsch, in which several Freikorps units were involved, the government disbanded them. Many of these men simply fled south to Bavaria, which had a significant degree of autonomy, and was by far the most conservative state in Germany. Here they would form various secret organizations or paramilitary groups. By now, Adolf Hitler was becoming a known entity down here too. The similarities in worldviews were obvious, and almost immediately, their paths would cross. Early in the life of the party, Adolf Hitler met a man named Ernst Röhm. Röhm, as stated, was a Freikorps man himself, who had taken part in the liberation of Bavaria from communist rule. Röhm wasn't your average Freikorps grunt, however. He was a well-regarded and highly decorated captain who had been in the army long before war had broken out. On top of this, he had spent time as a supply officer. In short, this was a man who knew the right people and knew how to get things others could not. He was so important in supplying the various paramilitary or Freikorps groups at the time that he was known as the Machine Gun King. Röhm wasn't a very complicated man. He was perhaps more interested in military and paramilitary matters than politics itself, and his ideology could be summed up pretty bluntly. He just wanted Germany to return to a position of military strength with a reformed army, and he saw himself as a vital part of that future army. His services would quickly be needed in the party, but Hitler at this time was far from the Führer of the future. The Hitler cult was in its infancy, and he was by no means secure in power. Quote, he had primarily thought of himself as a propagandist whose task it was to instill in the German people a sense of national consciousness and prepare them for an as yet unknown future leader who would save them, but his early speeches gave no indication that he thought that leader would be himself. End quote. It wasn't until late in 1922 that comparisons would begin to be made between Hitler and Mussolini, and only slowly did people hear his speeches and decide that actually he was the man who would save Germany. The lack of security in his role would lead to many fallings out with Röhm over the direction of his SA. Hitler's meetings were under constant attack from left-wing fanatics, well known for their brutality. At this time, the working class were extremely susceptible to communism, and Hitler's attempts to win them over were often difficult, but usually successful once they actually heard him out. Due to this, it was absolutely imperative that the speeches could carry on without serious interruptions or violence. When the need for men to protect these meetings arose, it was Röhm who Hitler turned to. Originally, the group was the gymnastics and sports section of the party, but in reality, they were anything but this. This group of men were trained by ex-army officers and Freikorps veterans who began to appear after the ban. Röhm had specifically recruited these men for the purpose. Among the ranks of the supposed gymnastic association were men who would become iconic in National Socialist history, like Emil Maurice and Rudolf Hess. The goal of this group wasn't purely defensive, however. They took the fight to the communists, and others too. Rival meetings were broken up, enemies were beaten up, and the group quickly gained a name for being hooligans. In late 1921, however, the unit was given a more fitting name, Sturmabteilung, aka Assault Battalion. It appears as if Hitler himself coined the phrase. On the 5th of October, he praised 80 of his gymnasts who had successfully driven out 800 violent communists out of the beer hall, where he then made a speech in which he used the title for the first time publicly. The title was immediately appealing to ex-servicemen, or Freikorps men, looking for a new home, as it brought to mind memories of the famous Strasstruppen in the First World War. Once more, they could have a cause to fight for, alongside like-minded comrades. At first, however, the SA would only ever be on a small scale, purely due to financial reasons. Hitler at this point had no wealthy backers like the communists did, and it was up to him to get whatever support he could to feed and arm these men. By December 1922, there was less than 100 SA men. Most of them were unemployed given the circumstances in Germany at the time. Essentially, they lived and died for the SA. There was nothing else. As the years went by, thousands of men would get by like this, purely with the hope that one day Hitler would get into power. In the early days, a man named Kurt Ludeck joined the party, and it was he that put up the funds to keep these men alive. He was able to offer free meals and equipment to the men. Ludeck and Hitler would work together in these early days to build up a small, yet powerful group of men to form the backbone of the bigger organisation later. Jean-Denis Lepage writes of those early days, quote, Ludeck had joined the Nazi Party in 1922 and soon felt there was a need to instill into SA men a pride in their special function as the party's defenders. Ludeck continued recruiting, accepting only the toughest and most able-bodied men who took an oath of allegiance on the swastika flag and pledged loyalty to Hitler. A band with 4 drummers and 4 fifers was formed, drills were held regularly, and every Wednesday night the entire company would assemble in a room Ludeck had rented above a cafe, where the men were lectured on the political aims of the NSDAP. Every Saturday and Sunday mornings, the unit would gather on the outskirts of Munich and drill outdoors. When bad weather prevented this, Ludeck's connections with far-right army officers allowed them to use the drill hall of the 2nd Bavarian Regiment. Soon, weapons and military equipment were acquired by Ludeck. Germany was flooded with the leftovers of the First World War. Uniforms, equipment, and even weapons were comparatively easily available for whoever had the money and the right connections." End quote. As well as Ludeck, of course, there was Ernst Röhm, who would work around the clock to make sure the men were well supplied using his connections. He managed to get a supply of money to Hitler from the secret army funds that had been used to finance the Freikorps behind the Allies' backs. Röhm, still in the army, was chief of staff to the Munich commandant, and found no trouble getting this set up to assist the party. Originally, an ex-naval officer named Ulrich Klinch was officially in charge of the SA, but in 1923, Hitler found a far more suitable man for the job, Hermann Göring. Göring had been credited during the war with shooting down 22 Allied aircraft, and was duly awarded the Pour le Mérite and the Iron Cross First Class. At the end of the war, he was the last commander of the infamous Red Baron's fighter squadron. With all this combined, he made quite a name for himself in Germany. After the war, however, the bitter Göring left Germany for Sweden, where he joined a local airline. He would quickly complain that the fatherland was calling him back, however, and in 1922 he would head to Munich, where he ended up at a Hitler speech. He was immediately taken in by this strange man and his movement, which seemed to have all the answers to Germany's problems. Soon he was a member of the party, and in January 1923 he was made commander of the SA. This suited Hitler nicely. He didn't want the Freikorps men getting too much control, and Göring wasn't even remotely one of these types. Göring would also help the upper classes reconsider their view of Hitler. Göring was famous in his own right, and was married to a Swedish aristocrat. This image did wonders to improve the image of the rough and rowdy SA, as well as the movement in general. Göring and Hitler's goals matched up absolutely. LePage writes, quote, "It should be organised and trained along strict military lines, but used only for practical, political and propaganda purposes. They should not be allowed to develop into a secret society or become conspirators. They should be seen in public, in their distinctive uniforms for street propaganda, and at meetings for security purposes." End quote. The view of the SA was at odds with the views of Ernst Röhm, who wished for the SA to be something much bigger and much more autonomous. Under Göring, the SA was actually structured far more professionally, and the organisation was much better organised. Many more men came to swell the ranks of the SA as a result. On parades, the SA were now the model of discipline. The story was rather different in reality, however. The SA were in street fights pretty much every day, and every political meeting ended up with chair legs and beer mugs flying between them, the communists, or whoever else was in the way. The SA were never going to be as easily tamed as Hitler or Göring hoped. These ex-Freikorps men were used to swearing loyalty to their unit commander, and struggled to fit into a life of being told what to do by Göring. Göring, for his part, was lazy, and had a tendency to lose interest in whatever it was he was doing. This impasse resulted in Göring obtaining a great distaste for the SA leadership. On one occasion, he referred to them as a, quote, "crowd of rucksack-wearing beer drinkers with narrow minds and provincial horizons," end quote. Hitler quickly realised that he would never be able to rely on the SA's undying loyalty. At the end of the day, most of these men were rowdy hooligans and were barely kept in line. It appeared as if many would be more loyal to their unit commanders than the Führer himself if push came to shove. To rectify this situation, a smaller group was founded, which was nominally under the SA. This was called the Schutzstaffel, better known as the SS. The same mistake would not be made this time around, and only the most loyal men were to join this new sort of Praetorian Guard. Julius Schreck, a man whose loyalty could never, ever be questioned, was chosen to lead. For the foreseeable future, the SS and the SA wouldn't get much in each other's way. The SS was simply too small, and was mainly used as Hitler's personal guard. In the background, however, dossiers were built up on party and SA members to be sure of their loyalty. In September 1923, Göring resigned as SA leader. Despite there being 8 different SA chiefs of staff during the organisation's existence, there was usually one man who was really in charge. at least until 1934, and the end of the essay's real relevance. This was Ernst Röhm. Röhm was born into a well-connected Bavarian family on the 28th of November, 1887. He had a good grammar school education, and then attended a military academy until he was commissioned in 1908. In the Great War, he was well regarded by all and fought with distinction. In 1916, he would be wounded, not once but 3 times at Verdun. For his efforts, he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class and ended up being transferred to a staff officer role with the 12th Bavarian Infantry Regiment. Here, he would display his excellent organisational skills that would make him invaluable later on to Hitler. Röhm was undoubtedly a brave fighter, but this side of his personality clashes uneasily with the other side. He was a homosexual who detested all women and rejected civilian life entirely. He was more like a false caricature of a homosexual warrior you'd hear about from ancient Greece. He only found personal and emotional fulfillment within the army. His sexual past isn't entirely clear, but later on it was evident they had a thing for young boys, and many young SA recruits would end up being groomed into his unfortunate catamites. After the collapse in 1918, Röhm's world collapsed around him. Everything that he loved was gone. His brothers in the trenches, the monarchy, his purpose. If it wasn't for the Freikorps, he would have been completely lost in the world. He was only ever meant to be a soldier. In everyday life, Röhm was a pretty vulgar man. He came across to others as extremely arrogant and prideful. He wasn't particularly nice to look at either, which added to this impression. He was fat, with a huge scar on his face from a bullet in the Great War. His nose had been disfigured from another injury too, and his current one was a result of plastic surgery. Röhm described himself as immature and wicked. To others, his views seemed pretty black and white. There were soldiers and civilians, friends and enemies. On the other hand, he had very confused political beliefs. He once said that he would, quote, rather come to terms with an enemy soldier than a German civilian, because the latter is a swine and I do not speak his language, end quote. At the same time, he claimed to be a socialist. In reality, he just wanted the best position for him and his men, and it was Hitler's movement that he felt best fit. In 1919, whilst in the Freikorps, he was still in the army. In July, he was tasked with concealing stocks of weapons from the Allied Control Commission, and here he would work his magic in logistics. He began to set up weapon and ammo dumps for monarchist and nationalist groups, and in Munich alone he had nearly 800 machine guns, 21,000 rifles, 300,000 hand grenades, and 8 million rounds of ammo. He also founded a political intelligence unit named the Iron Fist to liaise between different paramilitary groups and right-wing parties. This was how he came into contact with the German Workers' Party, which would later become the NSDAP. He was immediately captivated by Hitler and joined the party. Together they would form a great, yet strained, partnership. Röhm was a difficult man, but he truly was one of the only men Adolf Hitler would ever be able to call friend. Even Rudolf Hess, in later years, said that he probably didn't even fit into the friend category after all of those years of devotion, yet Röhm did. Quote, Hitler provided the will, the direction, and the concepts, whilst Röhm provided the men, the raw material that would take up Hitler's will and see it enforced. Röhm recognized the importance of political education in the army. From the start, always insisted on the primacy of the soldier over the politicians, but military effort could be combined with political activity. Hence Röhm's interest in the small party founded by Drexler and now ruled by Hitler. He saw in Hitler the demagogue he needed to mobilize mass support for his secret ambitions, end quote. Without Röhm and his connections, Hitler and his party might not have ever made it. It was he who brought in most of the key figures at the beginning. It was he who introduced Heinrich Hoffmann, one of the Führer's best friends and personal photographer, to Hitler. It was he who persuaded his commanding officer, Major von Epp, and nationalist poet, Dietrich Eckart, to raise 60,000 marks to purchase a new newspaper. The newspaper, the Volkischer Beobachter, ended up becoming absolutely instrumental in spreading the word of the party. Through Röhm's support, Hitler's prestige went through the roof, as Röhm himself was viewed as far more than his rank of captain suggests. He had friends absolutely everywhere. Dozens of vital financiers or military men who would otherwise have been repulsed by Hitler were reassured by Röhm. As a result, Röhm was perhaps the only man who could speak to Hitler on equal terms in the early days of the party. The downside of this equality was that Röhm would never be as dedicated to Hitler as Hitler required. The only reason Röhm did not take command of the SA himself was because he was officially still in the army. In reality though, he called the shots, and the 25-year-old Clinch, the original SA leader, was no more than a puppet. This state of affairs with the army continued until September 1923, and then he took an even more hands-on role with the SA. In 1923, the Bavarian government was beginning to crack down on the National Socialists. They were far too influential and were becoming a threat to the government itself, as opposed to an ally against communism. Hitler, feeling backed into a corner, knew it was now or never for action. In September 1923, Rome created an alliance of paramilitary groups named the Combat League. In total, there was around 70,000 uniformed activists within its ranks, and the SA was a key part. General Ludendorff was brought in as one of the joint leaders, which added incredible amounts of prestige to the movement. The group agreed on two major aims: overthrow the Weimar government and tear up the Versailles Treaty. During that tumultuous year of 1923, Rome and Hitler had differing aims. Rome believed that he could recapture the Ruhr from the French by force. Meanwhile, Hitler saw this as a ridiculous adventure, and that the time should instead be spent preparing to overthrow the Weimar government now it was so weak from the crippling inflation crisis. Hitler's route was chosen, and in November the NSDAP attempted the infamous Beer Hall Putsch. The plan was to seize power in Bavaria with Ludendorff and various other right-wing groups, and then march on the capital, just like Mussolini had done in Italy. Rome was instrumental in getting the putsch set up, and he provided huge ammunition dumps and arranged a lot of the events of that day alongside his beloved SA. As we know though, the putsch was a fiasco, but Rome was right there in the thick of it. He was duly found guilty of treason, but due to his connections, got only a short sentence. On the 1st of April 1924, he was released and gained permission from Hitler to relaunch the now banned SA under the name of Frontbahn. During Hitler's time in Landsberg prison, Rome dutifully built up the Frontbahn and made many additions, including Lieutenant Edmund Heinz, who would be a big name going forwards. The putsch had been an immediate setback for the National Socialists, but in the long term, it helped them out massively. Before this, the NSDAP had been limited to Bavaria, but now their horizons were wide open, and word spread about their deeds everywhere. Men with similar ideas all over the country saw the stories of Hitler's martyrs and felt compelled to join the cause. Rome's Frontbahn would explode as a result. In December 1924, Hitler was released from prison and was almost immediately allowed to enter politics once again, and in February 1925, the ban on the SA was lifted. The Frontbahn was then duly disbanded, and the SA was officially back in business. Rome's brief period of complete independence had emboldened him, however. Quote, "More than ever, Hitler was determined never to have an independent SA on the lines of the Erhard Brigade Freikorps. Rome, however, insisted that the NSDAP bosses had no business giving orders to his soldiers. In fact, Rome's affirmation to the primacy of the soldier was an idea that was anathema to Hitler. Besides, Rome employed the Frontbahn/SA units not exclusively for the protection of the NSDAP, but also for rival extreme right parties, and this of course infuriated Hitler. Before Hitler and Rome openly clashed, the latter flung himself into the task of expanding the SA, but he demanded more independence than ever before. The sudden growth of the SA gave Rome a new importance. His success made Hitler uneasy, as the SA threatened to overshadow the power of his own political party. Henceforth, deciding to employ only legal means to win power, Hitler categorically forbade the SA to carry weapons. He repeated his intention of making the SA a party organisation, with its function limited to political, propaganda, and security purposes." End quote. In Mein Kampf, whilst in prison, Hitler wrote extensively that the SA must not be a private army or an auxiliary of the German army. Instead, it was to be of the party and for the party, not some rowdy band of hooligans disobeying his orders. This issue would not go away, and Rome and Hitler would clash over it all the way up until that fateful day in 1934. Even now, Rome listened to Hitler, but meanwhile dreamed of taking over Germany in an armed revolution. He didn't have Hitler's iron patience that would allow him to wait for 8 years from his release until his goal was finally accomplished. Quote, "The happy-go-lucky Rome envisaged the SA as a citizens' army intended to carry on the political fight by violent means. A violent revolution had to be prepared, and Rome hoped to achieve his aims by using Hitler's NSDAP. Hitler disagreed, and was often disturbed to find out that SA men were not entirely his own. They were often unavailable to his party because of training, manoeuvres, parades, or even working for the other extreme right-wing parties. When Hitler went to inspect the SA, he was received politely, but was not permitted to command Rome's men. The SA refused to take orders from the NSDAP, and Hitler had no choice but to compromise. Instead, he had to yield, and thus his own most personal creation acquired for him something of the aspect of the moon, which would always only turn one side towards the earth." End quote. In the mid-1920s, Rome was causing other problems for Hitler too. He had already become somewhat estranged from the Nazi movement due to the direction of the SA, but now he was getting himself into all sorts of very public homosexual scandals. Hitler usually parred these off publicly by saying that these were entirely private affairs, despite his absolute disgust to Rome's homosexuality in private. Now, though, it was becoming nearly unavoidable, and men like Ludendorff urged Hitler to disavow Rome, and he was giving the NSDAP a bad name. Hitler duly did so, and on the 30th of April, 1925, Rome resigned from the SA leadership. On Rome's dismissal, Hitler commented, quote, "In memory of glorious and difficult days which we have survived together, with heartfelt thanks for your comradeship, and in the hope that you will not refuse me your personal friendship in the future." End quote. In reality, though, Hitler was now rid of Rome, and the SA was much more under control. He had himself appointed as Oberster Sturmabteilung Führer, Supreme SA leader. As for Rome, he tried fitting into civilian life, but due to his character, history, and sexuality, he was shunned pretty much everywhere he went, and he was practically unemployable. In 1928, he was offered a role as a military advisor from the Bolivian government, and he duly set off to South America for 2 years. Hitler quickly realised that as Supreme SA leader, he had a problem on his hands. The non-Bavarian SA leaders looked at Hitler with skepticism and were far from loyal. The only way to deal with this was to appoint someone else as chief of SA staff, whilst he himself would remain as Supreme SA leader. The man he chose was Franz Felix Pfeffer von Solomon, although he tended to go by and preferred going by Franz von Pfeffer, as it sounded more aristocratic, and Salomon sounded somewhat Jewish. Pfeffer had been a prominent Freikorps officer whom had fought on the Baltic, Polish and Ruhr fronts. In 1923, Pfeffer was SA chief in Westphalia, and in 1925 he became Gauleiter and SA commander in the Ruhr. In the Ruhr, he had caused havoc with the French authorities and had been condemned to death in absentia. Hitler felt he would be much more reliable. He gave Pfeffer plenty of power in order to win over the SA in North Germany, and he attempted to have the SA moulded into his image under this new chief. The SA were isolated from the army and were now officially forbidden to bear arms. Instead, they were to be trained in wrestling and martial arts so they could act as the fist of the party, while the party itself acted as the brain. To make the SA more appealing, discipline was ramped up. There was now a fully fleshed out hierarchy of ranks, as well as new banners, flags and bands to satisfy the German craving for uniforms and emblems. Pfeffer was the one who introduced the iconic brown SA uniform. The colour was used as the uniforms were in plentiful supply. They had been intended for the German colonial troops, but obviously, these colonies no longer existed. On the 19th and 20th of August 1927, the fruits of both Rome's and then Pfeffer's labours were revealed. The Nazi Party held its second annual national rally at Nuremberg, and a parade was held of 20,000 SA men. The organisation was absolutely ballooning, whilst the SS, formerly under the SA, languished in obscurity. By 1928, the SA was a flourishing national organisation with a whole handful of regional commands. By 1930, the SA could boast 75,000 men. In 1925, when Pfeffer took over, there was only 2,000 men. Things weren't all well, however, as usual, and history was repeating itself. The SA did the exact same thing as last time. They became overconfident and prideful and began to pull away from the party. The stormtroopers were unreliable, disunited and malcontent. Pfeffer began to demand more and more independence for the SA, and tensions raised considerably. LePage writes of Pfeffer's lofty goals, quote, "Pfeffer and the new SA leaders never abandoned activism and regarded Hitler's growing political success from 1929 onward as little more than the springboard for their own revolutionary, armed assault on the Weimar Republic." Pfeffer was unsentimental and Prussian rather than Bavarian in outlook. He was not taken in by the Hitler myth, that flabby Austrian, as he called him. He and many high-ranking SA officers had a low opinion of the civilian branch of the Nazi Party. Elements in the SA continued to challenge Hitler's leadership and demanded a greater say in the running of the NSDAP. In particular, they demanded more funds and insisted on the nomination of SA officers as party candidates in the Reichstag elections. In fact, Pfeffer's concept of the SA differed little from Rome's. As an ex-officer and Freikorps leader, the obstinate Pfeffer still thought only in politico-military terms. According to him, the SA was to be a training ground for the army, but a different army than Weimar's neutral Reichswehr. Pfeffer advocated an SA army, both military and political. He announced that the SA was the vehicle for the future German army, the very same notion that had cost Rome his position. The infuriated Hitler could not prevent Pfeffer from having secret meetings with the pro-SA Reichswehr officers attempting to involve the tiny Weimar army in the paramilitary training of his stormtroopers. In the SA headquarters in the late 1920s, secret lists were drawn up at SA headquarters of annoying army personalities to be eliminated when the stormtroopers seized power, end quote. The most important aspect of all to Pfeffer was that he and his friends enjoyed high-paying jobs at the top of society when the National Socialists, and by extension, the SA gained power and could execute their plans. By 1929, the mood between Hitler and the SA was poisonous. The SA considered the movement not revolutionary enough. They wanted to seize power now and by force, and when they were in power, they wanted the old army done away with and their own type of army installed. To Hitler, this was never even a consideration, and these same old arguments carried on forever. The SA wanted more and more power, but Hitler wouldn't and couldn't give it to them. At the same time, Hitler couldn't afford to break with the SA. What resulted was an endless game of walking along the tightrope to keep things between the two extremes until he came to power. In Berlin especially, the SA were incredibly prideful and unreliable. Quote, on the whole, the SA rank and file continued to fulfill their propaganda and protection role, if somewhat reluctantly, but also followed a more or less independent course, with little interest in Nazi politics, playing at soldiers, going on manoeuvres, marching in uniform, brawling, singing camp songs, and drinking themselves into a stupor, whilst nostalgic veterans tried to recapture the lost comradeship of the trenches, end quote. Effectively, the top brass of the SA was LARPing, whilst the politicians like Hitler and Goebbels genuinely tried to bring about their vision of Germany. The SA, whenever they gained any power at all, were absolutely detested because they would flaunt and brag like spoiled rich kids. These men were a far cry from what the NSDAP was supposed to represent. They cruised around in cars, drunk, engaged in degenerate sexual behaviour, and treated the local German civilians like dirt. The lower down in the SA you went, the more well-meaning men you discovered, but many at this level too were essentially just thugs who found a way to channel their energy. On the flip side, the communists had the exact same thing going on, and they were even more brutal than the SA were. Hitler Youth Boys or SA troops were targeted non-stop for years, and the communists seemed to go especially for children wherever possible, as they were easy targets. The SA at this point were a necessary evil to Hitler, no matter how much they embarrassed him, and were optically horrendous at times. The quality of the SA had gone down the drain, especially in recent times as the Great Depression hit. Hordes of bitter unemployed men all found a new home at once in the SA, and couldn't be properly integrated immediately, resulting in a far more unruly mob than usual. LePage writes, quote, during the disastrous economic crisis of 1929-32, the social background of the SA men underwent a significant change. The aging war veterans and ex-Freikorps men were gradually replaced with younger people of the declining lower and middle classes. SA men were not recruited from the soft or timid section of society. Many ruined shopkeepers, unemployed white-collar workers, impoverished farmers, jobless lumpen proletariats, poor students, and malcontent classes joined the SA. Many were young, attracted by the dynamism of the movement, by its fanaticism and rejection of any compromise, the untold opportunities for heroic deeds, and the constant clashes with political enemies. To these must be added many opportunists, sexual deviants, juvenile delinquents, and criminals, the dregs of society, who often rise to the surface in periods of profound dislocation and collapse. Alongside the unemployed, criminal elements indeed infiltrated the SA, and, as a result, the perennial underground struggle between the SA and their opponents took on the character of gang warfare, reminiscent of Al Capone's Chicago, end quote. It was during this time, and as a result of this new influx, that the fighting with the communists reached a new peak, especially in Berlin. During these years, it would be the SA that became the face of the party, especially abroad, as opposed to the party itself. Thoughts of Nazis abroad were hooligans beating each other senseless in the streets, not Hitler and Goebbels trying to implement radical reforms to eliminate class barriers and unite Germany. Things continued down this path. The winter of 1931-32 was the coldest Germany had seen for a century, and 17.5 million Germans were on welfare. Most of these people couldn't afford warm clothes, and many had nowhere to live. It shouldn't be surprising that many of these looked to the SA for relief. Here they could find a reason to live, a roof over their heads, camaraderie, and most important of all, food. These men's loyalty to National Socialism was dubious at best. Many probably didn't even understand what they were fighting for, or what National Socialism entailed. During the early 30s, the tide was blatantly swinging towards Hitler's movement, and millions joined the bandwagon. Quote, "Joining the SA was not often the result of profound thought, nor necessarily indicative of full commitment to Nazi ideology. Many joined on a whim, for fun, to show off, to be somebody, having been dragged along by a friend, or simply to have a daily hot meal. In an atmosphere of violence, uncertainty, and economic scarcity, people could easily change sides. In the early 1930s, when it had become clear that Hitler was the coming man, and that his party had a good chance of achieving power, many jobless people, including turncoat communists, thought he was the man for the future." End quote. On the other hand, there was a small percentage of the upper classes in the SA. Around 5.8% from the upper middle and upper classes. In their ranks were many aristocrats. One was Prince Frederick Christian Fürst zu Schaumburg-Lippe, who saw similarities between Hitler and a man whom he idolized, Napoleon. He actually became SA Standartenführer, or colonel. He would often speak in public, and he gained the party significant prestige and was able to assist in adjusting the public viewpoint away from that of a band of thugs. Instilling any sense of loyalty or complex political thought into this now gigantic mass of people was near impossible. Most were barely educated and couldn't care less for politics. They just wanted to get into the thick of things without having to think too much. Many of the SA were more anti-communist than pro-Nazi, as many had been communists themselves and were completely disillusioned with that endless class struggle. Quote, "On the whole, SA men had a barely concealed contempt for the Nazi party, but were fascinated by Hitler, of whom they had great expectation." End quote. Essentially, the SA were the ones on the street doing all the fighting, so they looked down upon the politicians of the party. They felt they deserved more and more power for their hard work. They saw it entirely in black and white. In reality though, beating communists in the streets and defending the meetings was only more of a side quest in comparison to the main event in the NSDAP offices, where the party was working around the clock to win over the nation. The political indoctrination they did receive was pretty low tier. Simple slogans and black and white concepts were used. Short essay novels were a pretty big thing at the time, which were essentially modern-day Wild West style stories of essay men's heroics, which worked as excellent propaganda. Very little politics was actually used in them. It was more about fighting for a cause and maintaining morale, as opposed to a lecture. Songs were also a big part of maintaining this morale and giving the men a sense of purpose, and the essay had quite a collection of them. In 1932, a 294-page pocket-sized essay song booklet was published. Perhaps it was in Hitler's interest not to make the essay too political, as otherwise they could become even more unruly and revolutionary. Quote, "Hitler's problem was to keep the spirit of the essay alive, without allowing it to go too far into revolutionary action. What Hitler most feared was a head-on collision with the police, above all, a conflict with the German army. The combination of mass unemployment, the breakdown of traditional political allegiances, and the culture which embraced violent, aggressive values raised the Nazi movement to become the most successful practitioner of violent street politics that Germany had ever seen." End quote. This mission of keeping the essay on the straight and narrow wasn't an easy one, and they often went off course. Revolts were common. A major one was the Stens Revolt. Stens was a good friend of Pfeffer's and a cocky son of a rich Junker family. After the war, he joined the Freikorps Pfeffer, and later, when Pfeffer became chief of the SA, he appointed Stens to a high position. The revolt that bears Stens' name was for the typical reasons. The SA felt that Hitler's slow and steady strategy of gaining power legally was the wrong course. They wanted revolution, and they wanted it now. There was also the matter of pay. They argued that they lived in squalor, whilst the party elite lived in luxury. Stens led the charge, and in August 1930 he started threatening Goebbels, demanding that the SA be given Reichstag seats, more political power, and more money. When Hitler got word of the revolt, he immediately headed to Berlin by plane and began talking to various SA units, making them promises and telling them how close they were to ultimate victory. They just had to remain patient. The SA men received Hitler with joy, and they swore an oath of loyalty to him personally. Pfeffer was then swept aside, and Hitler himself became chief of the SA as an interim. Soon afterwards, Hitler arranged for a proper replacement, as he simply didn't have time to run both the SA and the party himself. When Rome left all those years ago, his parting words were, quote, "You have only give the word. Be at the cigar store at 6 a.m. on such and such a day with your men, and I shall be there." End quote. Hitler reached out to his old friend, who was still in Bolivia, and invited him to come back home. Why Hitler would make such a move may seem strange. But the two had a strange relationship. No matter how much the two fell out, they were usually good personal friends, and it was this personal friendship which Hitler appealed to in order to get Rome back. Perhaps he thought that Rome wouldn't be able to push for concessions like he had years ago, due to how big the party was now. At the same time though, the SA had grown, and had just revolted. It was a confusing appointment. One man above all was furious at this reinstatement, and that was Goering, who had wanted the position again for himself. Rome may have gotten his old job back, but he made a very powerful enemy in the process. On the 5th of January 1931, Rome made his return, and immediately was up to his old antics again. He regathered his old clique of men, known for their corruption, their alcoholism, their criminality, their opportunism, and perhaps worst of all, their homosexuality, when they preyed on young boys. Around them formed a group of opportunistic young boys who ended up essentially becoming comfort boys for Rome and his men to use after their frequent heavy nights of drinking. Some of these young boys were duly rewarded for their services by being given roles in the SA. Rome's clique were as bad as he was in this regard. Edmund Heinz was appointed as SA Obergruppenführer by Rome, as well as Chief of Police at Breslau. Here he directed a network of procurers of young boys. One of these men was named Peter Graninger, who was paid a large salary of 200 marks for the job of, quote, finding handsome boyfriends and organising the festivals of debauchery, which Ernst Röhm and his staff enjoyed. Graninger had been one of Rome's partners since 1928, and was now given cover in the SA intelligence service to keep Rome and his friends supplied with fresh young men. His main hunting ground was Gelisa High School in Munich, whence he recruited no fewer than 11 boys, whom he first tried out himself before passing them on to Rome and his highly dubious clique, end quote. Rome, Heinz, and other men like this spent many days and nights in their beloved Berlin, in which they visited nightclubs, casinos, and Turkish baths. They held frequent banquets, followed by orgies at his SA headquarters. Within Rome's clique, theft, corruption, misappropriation of funds, sex with underage boys, even rape and murder were all accepted and swept under the rug. How much Hitler knew of these escapades is up to debate. He had often stated in the past that as long as Rome was up to his homosexual acts consensually with of-age men, then it was a private matter. He said, though, that if he ever got up to anything with young boys, then he would crush him. It's unlikely that Hitler knew about the high school grooming, or the specifics, but he certainly knew Rome was up to no good. The issue was to be postponed to later, however, as he needed the SA in one piece if he was to get to power, and Rome had the total loyalty of the SA. LePage writes, quote, fierce indignation was voiced from within the party. Many Nazi leaders complained that Rome and his scandalous gang were damaging the reputation of the NSDAP. However, in the period 1931 to 3, Hitler strove frantically to seize power. As he badly needed his SA commander's organizational skills and unquenchable drive to achieve his goal, and because he could not afford to imperil the efficiency of his private force because of moral scruples, Hitler turned a deaf ear to complaints about Rome's wild drinking orgies, debauchery, and corruption, and the low behaviour of his immediate circle, end quote. Aside from the debauchery, Rome was immediately successful in his actual job, keeping the SA in check. He enacted new reforms and tried to place as much power as he could into his own hands in order to curb the SA's excesses. 1931 was a vital year for the party, and the SA had to behave. In February, Hitler demanded that the SA refrain from street fighting altogether and banned them from carrying weapons. In response, Stenz once again revolted. This time he had the backing of Otto Strasser, who represented the far more socialist side of National Socialism, or rather what some would call National Bolshevism. Strasser wanted to abolish private property and wanted state control of business and industry. Stenz demanded the usual, more funds, more representation, etc., and most importantly, he once again demanded that the revolutionary course be taken, not the current legal one, no matter how much it was working. Stenz felt that Hitler was betraying the working class by working with industrialists and other capitalists to get himself into power. Many SA men were of course former communists, and as a result detested the capitalists and couldn't wait for the chance to deal with them. Stenz once more occupied the Berlin party headquarters, as well as Der Angriff newspaper offices on the 31st of March 1931. They publicly announced their plan to remove Goebbels and form their own dissident SA corps in Berlin. They then took over various meeting places of the SA men, still loyal to Hitler, and fights broke out, resulting in several injuries on both sides. The rebels then planned a demonstration to try to convince Hitler to change course. Hitler had no intention of doing anything of the kind. As soon as he heard of this, he headed to Berlin with Rome, several loyal SA units, as well as a handful of SS men, and they immediately began the routine from last time. They ran from beer hall to beer hall, making promises of better pay and other concessions. Those who returned to the ranks were not to be punished, the Führer said. The revolt dissipated, and Stenz barely escaped with his life and left Germany. Otto Strasser left the following year. A purge of the SA was then undertaken, in which Rome kicked out several SA officers from Pfeffer's time and replaced them with his own friends. As for Hitler, this revolt was a huge PR victory. It showed he was completely serious about his claim to take power legally. As a result, the army suddenly lifted the restrictions on the party. The army would now accept men who belonged to the Nazi party, and officers and soldiers of the army were now allowed to attend Nazi meetings. The SS also proved their loyalty by putting down the revolt, and were rewarded greatly as a result with more duties. There was another SA revolt of note in Franconia in the exact same month that Hitler came to power, January 1933. This was put down by Rome just as rapidly. There were two, or perhaps rather three phases of the SA. There was the struggle to get into power, and then there was the time in power. The latter could be split into before and after 1934. So before 1933, when Hitler finally came to power, in summary, what did the SA actually do? Paramilitary groups and bands of men working in tandem with a political cause was nothing new to Germany. The communists had dominated the streets for a while now, and their numbers absolutely dwarfed that of the SA at first, especially in Berlin. As for the other parties, the SA and the Nazis had something that the other middle-of-the-road parties simply didn't have: energy. The vast majority of SA men were under 30, single, and hopelessly lost in life. These men could devote every hour of every day to the cause, or rather, the SA version of the Nazi cause. Many of these men, especially during the Great Depression, were completely reliant on the SA for survival. Many lived in SA homes, which tended to be rooms in the back of beer halls, or empty buildings whose owners were Nazi sympathisers. Often their only set of clothes was the infamous brown uniform. Most of these men had nothing at all to lose. Their life was the movement. Quote, "Those desperate men, both ruthless ruffians and sincere idealists, had nothing to lose and no other hope than the Nazi movement's victory. They were sometimes convinced of the need to serve Germany in our hour of need, and many of them were generally ready to sacrifice themselves for the movement, giving up time and personal safety in the expectation that they would someday receive tangible compensation. Therefore, most SA men did not fear violence." End quote. These men spent their days doing a number of things to further the cause. One was marching to show off the movement to the German public. Germans, historically, have loved uniforms, order, and the like, and the sight of these men marching down the streets with their banners, songs, and slogans in their matching uniforms stirred feelings inside many whom were previously on the fence. Other less glorious jobs included handing out leaflets, putting up posters, or driving around in propaganda vans shouting slogans. Other tasks which endeared them to the public were some of their Robin Hood-like actions. During the Great Depression, when a farmer or shopkeeper would declare bankruptcy and his home or property was put up for auction, then the SA would duly appear and start messing with the auction. They would turn up in large numbers and interrupt the auctioneer with silly questions or outbid the serious buyers, only to later reveal that they suddenly couldn't pay. If somehow the auction was still going ahead, they would just start fights and stop the sale. These scenes would always cause a huge spectacle and win over the hearts and minds of those in attendance or those who heard about it. The SA also set about stopping what they saw as degenerate or pacifist media. For example, the SA single-handedly stopped the showing of All Quiet on the Western Front, a film which was meant to convey the pointlessness of war. Quote, "Goebbels organised a plot. He distributed to members of the party, SA and Hitler Youth a number of tickets for the cinema where the film was being shown in Berlin. The Nazis crowded into the cinemas and during the showing created disorder by booing, released mice, setting off stink bombs in the dark and molesting people in the audience. The rowdiness was such that the police were called, but upon arrival could find no obvious culprits as everyone present merely stated that they wanted to see the film. The following day, the Nazi press was full of the story of the so-called spontaneous eruption of popular anger against this scandalous, unpatriotic and anti-German film." End quote. The film was then banned by the German Film Censors Board for public showing. The role they are most famous for, of course, is fights with the communists. These often came about as one side would always infiltrate the other's meetings. Groups of brown shirts would elbow their way into enemy meetings and disrupt them in order to spread their message instead. On the flip side, they would stop the communists from doing the same. Communists would often rise mid-speech when a man like Goebbels was talking, and would begin pelting beer glasses or chair legs at him. The SA would then rise and give these men a serious kicking. Hundreds died over the years from these kinds of engagements. The main communist enemy went by the name of the Communist Red Front Fighters League. Amazingly, the League were even bigger thugs than their opponents. The League and the SA espoused completely opposite ideologies, yet both agreed on the need to take power in a violent revolution. The League was directly funded by Moscow, trained by Soviet officers, and was the German Communist Party's official militia. This vassalage to Moscow was both a help and a hindrance. On the one hand, they had effectively unlimited money and support, whilst the SA scraped a living. On the other hand, they were tied down by Stalin's rigid ideology. They had to wait for instructions from Moscow, and they were forbidden to ally with socialists. Meanwhile, the National Socialists could react on the fly, and essentially had free rein instead of being bogged down, whilst waiting to receive orders from a foreign government. This was also Germany, a fiercely nationalist nation. International communism was a pretty alien concept, and the SA won over far more Germans over time than the communists ever did, simply due to their ability to appeal to patriotism. The peak of this violence was reached in the lead up to Hitler's seizure of power. The communists got desperate and stepped the game up. In July of 1932, there was a ridiculous total of 99 dead on the two sides, as well as hundreds of wounded. Every time a brown shirt would fall in battle against the communists, Goebbels would whip up a propaganda miracle, which the communists couldn't even dream of coming close to. These men were painted as martyrs for Germany, against the invading foreign ideology of communism. The most famous martyr of all was of course none other than Horst Wessel, who created the National Socialists' official anthem. Horst was a well-educated man from a good middle-class Berlin family. In 1926, however, he joined the SA and quickly made a name for himself. He was greatly loved by all those around him in the SA, and by 1929 he was appointed leader of SA Troop 34 in Berlin. That same year, he dropped out of university in order to better devote himself to the cause. Wessel had written a poem too, titled "Raise High the Flag," which later became the Horst Wessel song. Goebbels himself immediately spotted Horst's potential as a well-educated and idealistic National Socialist, and had grand plans for him in the future. On the 23rd of February 1930, however, young Wessel's apartment was broken into, and he was shot dead by a group of communists, led by a man named Albrecht Höhler. He was immediately made National Socialism's greatest martyr by a landslide, and his name is far better known today than the dead from the Beer Hall Putsch, or 15-year-old Hitler youth boy Herbert Norkus, who was stabbed to death by communists. Goebbels whipped up a propaganda masterclass on the back of Horst's death. He wrote in Der Angriff, quote, "A Christian socialist, a man who calls out through his deeds, 'Come to me, I shall redeem you.' A divine element works in him, making him the man he is and causing him to act in this way, and no other. One man must set an example and offer himself up as a sacrifice. Well then, I am ready." End quote. But the communists actually caused the legend to be what it is today. At Horst's funeral, the procession of wagons was barely guarded as the SA men were all at the graveyard ready to receive him there. The communists rushed the wagons and pelted both Horst's coffin and Horst's weeping mother with stones. They desperately tried to get to the coffin and despoil the corpse, but the police stopped them just in time. At the graveyard too, stones were launched in their hundreds towards the procession. Goebbels couldn't have asked for a better spectacle. Eventually, even films were made about Wessel, and he featured heavily in propaganda posters. Streets and squares all over Germany were named after him, as well as an SA regiment. In 1944, an SS regiment was given his name. As for Höhler, he was taken out of prison in 1933 when the Nazis came to power, where he was duly driven to the forest and executed. When the National Socialist dream finally came true on the 30th of January 1933, the SA celebrated with a torch-lit parade whilst Adolf Hitler looked on from the window of the Chancellery, clearly overcome with emotion. Things weren't all sunshine and rainbows, however. Hitler had come to power completely legally, whereas the SA had always wanted a total revolution. Hitler's initial moves worked wonders for unemployment and the German people at large, but disappointed the SA. On top of this, the SA's ranks had swelled dramatically, and there was now 2 to 4 million of them, and Rome was getting lofty ideas far above his station. The SA's most important role after coming to power was that of policing, and there was now effectively a three-pronged police effort shared between the regular police, the SA and the SS, to deal with the initial issues of Hitler's ascension to power. The SA, however, were far more brutal than the rest, as after all of those years of struggle, starvation, and violence, they wanted their revenge. The left-wing parties, and especially the communists, were effectively shoved out of public life and ceased to exist. Rallies were broken up, coffee houses rampaged, speakers arrested. When the Reichstag was set alight by a Dutch communist, the SA flung into action on Hitler's orders, and plans were found of a supposed communist takeover. Whether these were real or not is unknown, but regardless, communists were now persecuted en masse, and the SA achieved their final victory against their old enemy, whom had killed so many of their friends. Jews, too, were heavily harassed by the SA, and they felt the tables had now turned. They felt they'd been wronged by the Jews when they had been in a position of power, and now it was time for revenge on the enemy. When they were officially sanctioned to act against the Jews, they relished the opportunity. All over the world once Hitler came to power, there was Jewish-led boycotts, which eventually turned into a mass movement, full of not just Jews, but all kinds of people. In retaliation, there was a one-day boycott of Jewish businesses in Germany, and it was the SA who would lead the charge. They stood outside Jewish businesses and reminded shoppers that they were about to buy from a Jewish-led business, and that the Jews were currently boycotting Germany. The Star of David was painted on windows, and entrances were blocked, although it was demanded that force not be used, as Hitler felt this would raise tensions and make Germany's life difficult. On the 10th of May, the iconic book burning took place, which was actually spontaneous, but the SA, Hitler Youth, and Nazi supporters joined in their thousands. Pacifist, anti-German, communist, and degenerate books were all thrown in the flames. A large amount of the authors were Jewish, and it was the influence from these books and their authors that had been destroying the moral foundation of the country, according to Hitler. Overall, though, the SA's orgy of revenge led to the SA's downfall. Their excess was off the charts. Their victory was more that of a conquering army than that of a political movement. LePage writes, quote, "Many of both the new volunteers and the old SA men were more motivated by the desire for self-enrichment than political ideology. The open contempt for law and order shown by the newly created Nazi state encouraged those impulses of cruelty, sadism, envy, and revenge, which are normally repressed or controlled in normal society. The SA exploited the power they were given to plunder and terrorize at random. They became mobsters, except they did not have to hide their activities or fear of retribution from the state, as their underworld was the state, and they enjoyed complete impunity." End quote. This impunity, however, was only temporary, and Hitler's patience would only last so long. The SA acted like newly rich gangsters and cruised the streets in their fancy cars, where they engaged in excessive drinking, debauchery, random acts of violence, and harassment. The German population was the entire point in Hitler's revolution, and now the brown shirts were treating them like dirt. Slowly, the hate built up, and the more the SA gave in to excess, the quicker the clock ticked down on their demise. The reality is that the SA had already served their usefulness. In a way, they had been tricked. Hitler had to put up with their disloyalty, rowdiness and the like, as it meant he could get to power. Now, all their leverage was gone. What could they offer Hitler? Right now, all they were was a weight around his neck. They were giving his movement a bad name all over the world. Their demands, now that Hitler was in power, were ridiculous and from another planet. Their political tact was non-existent. They wanted a total overhaul of German society. There was no patience. They demanded everything, and they demanded it all at once. To the actual politicians in the party, the SA were becoming a ridiculous liability. The worst offence of all was the SA's improvised prisons they seemed to be setting up everywhere. Anyone, even remotely suspected of being an enemy of the state, was whisked off by the SA and ended up languishing in these improvised dungeons where they were brutally beaten and interrogated. Quote, "Goering, by that time Prussian Prime Minister and Minister of the Interior, realised that he had lost control of the SA and that his authority in Germany's largest state was being undermined. He therefore ordered a senior civil servant and police officer, Rudolf Diels, the creator of the Gestapo, to inquire into the SA prisons. Diels stuck his nose into the private SA bunkers and reported to Goering that they apparently existed everywhere, and between 40,000 and 50,000 enemies of the fatherland were languishing in them. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Justice had received countless complaints of the bad treatment meted out to suspects and prisoners. Further, the excesses of the SA gave the world the impression of Germany being a chaotic and ill-disciplined nation." End quote. Whilst the SA enjoyed their new riches, excesses, and victory, others began to plan their demise. Goering and Diels fired off reports to Hitler, which clearly displayed what was going on, but Hitler began to cope and claimed that surely the situation couldn't last forever. Revolution had to be replaced by evolution, stabilization, and the enforcement of the regime. Regardless, he was greatly upset and quickly had the prisons closed down. The other excesses, however, continued. Quote, "The SA had taken into their ranks large numbers of people whose political reliability was, from the Nazis' point of view, highly questionable. The SA had been mainly recruited from the unemployed and the unemployable. Like the gangsters they were envious and avid for prestige, power, and rich pickings. Their motives were as crude as their manners, and they enjoyed their violence, the fun of being feared, their officially recognised gangsterism, and their power. What most of them wanted was money, fun, and games, the continuation and the increase of their disorganised but nonetheless legal terrorism at the expense of the German community, now that what they considered was their party was in charge. Even Rome's position within the Nazi movement was questioned, and came under pressure from more law-abiding sections of the Nazi party. His overtly homosexual affairs provoked an outraged response from many sources. Elements of the NSDAP were concerned by the growing number of senior SA officers appointed by Rome from among his homosexual acquaintances. The bad company around Rome created a potential powder keg. The SA men caused increasing difficulties for the new regime as they persisted in violent actions which were condemned by many Nazi leaders. The SA threatened, insulted, and molested respectable German citizens. They appeared difficult to control, they caused unease within the Nazi party itself, and were highly unpopular with the population at large. Their violent behaviour was making conservative people wonder if the Nazis were really fit for power. Once the Nazi dictatorship had been established, the SA was less useful to Germany's new leadership. In August 1933, the SA were dismissed from the auxiliary police organised by Goering. Their indiscipline, strength, and menacing independence had already set them apart from central authority. The dismissal of his men made Rome furious." End quote. By 1934, it was clear that the SA had to go. The population feared them. They had become a rival to the regular army, a threat to civil order, a challenge to Hitler's power, a ridiculous financial burden, costing Germany a fortune, and to top it off, a ridiculous embarrassment to the party. Meanwhile, the SS was in the shadows, a far more efficient and cheaper alternative, which far better suited the Third Reich's needs now that Hitler was actually in power. When 1934 rolled around, the SA caused problems in all three key areas that Hitler cared about. They were a drain on his economic power, they were an unreliable and out-of-control nightmare that deeply impacted his relationship with the army, and thus his military power. And lastly, due to the horrific lack of discipline, they were the bane of his existence in foreign relations. The main issue of these was the military one. Rome had always wanted a violent and total revolution, and even now that the National Socialists were in power, he was espousing this view. Rome was not like Rosenberg, Hess, or the like, who owed their entire political career to Hitler. Rome was a man in his own right, with hundreds of thousands of loyal followers, and a deep web of connections, which made him a complicated man to deal with. He couldn't just be sidelined, like Rosenberg and Hess themselves eventually were. Rome walked around like he owned the place, and his ego was inflated beyond belief. In this delusion, he believed that he could somehow convince and get Hitler on side with his plan to sideline the current army to allow the creation of a new People's Army. Rome also wanted soldiers like himself to be the ones running the state, not the cowardly politicians. As noted earlier, Rome felt nothing but disdain for the common man. Quote, "As a matter of fact, Rome and his SA leadership were not more left or more socialist or less nationalist than Hitler. The truth was that they wanted honours, rewards, and power, and they wanted them now. Rome's dearest ambition was to obtain the post of Minister of War, and dreamed of establishing the Reichswehr as a traditionalist yet popular army, a force led by his SA political soldiers who would rule Germany. His greedy gang of opportunistic henchmen wanted high posts and important functions in the Nazi state, administration, and army. As the SA leadership was largely deprived of high office or significant advancement, and as the long-desired control over the armed forces lay far beyond their reach, anger and discontent increased among them." End quote. From mid-1933 until the summer of 1934, this issue of whether or not Germany would have a second revolution was at the forefront of everyone's minds. This left Hitler with a dilemma. There was never any chance of revolution, civil war or the like. Hitler loved the German people and had no interest in seeing them destroy themselves in a bloody revolution. He had got to power with the help of conservatives and capitalists. Without them, he never would have gotten here. Now that he was in power, he wanted to win them over to be fully fledged National Socialists. Rome wanted to destroy them. In the battle to win over Hitler, the peaceful and logical side that was actually funding Hitler's party was always going to win out over Rome's rowdy and reckless SA who had outlived their usefulness. The only thing Rome had going for him was his personal power and Hitler's friendship. Despite all of these disagreements, they were still friends who had been through everything together. In 1934, the SA were left with little to nothing to do except wallow in their discontent and get bright ideas of revolution. The lower ranks, too, felt they had received little material reward for all of their hard work in getting Hitler to power. They felt that Hitler had sold them out. According to them, all he cared about was wooing the middle and conservative classes. They'd literally been used and dumped. Over a decade of fighting in the streets, with nothing to show for it, they felt. Perhaps they had a point, but by the same token, was the reward not the new National Socialist state that they had been fighting for? Their viewpoint was understandable, but at the same time, a little illogical. Unemployment was being destroyed in Germany, and Hitler was doing exactly what he had promised to do in terms of Germany as a whole. Their goals seemed unclear and ridiculous. They were still focused on petty class differences, whilst Hitler and the party were focused on sweeping away the class barriers. Quote, "The SA men drank, ridiculed intellectualism, openly mocked the NSDAP leadership, coarsely attacked religion, and bawled in the streets obscene and revolutionary songs like this. Hoist the Hohenzollerns at the lamppost, let the dogs sway there until they fall, hang a black pig in the synagogue, and hurl hand grenades into the churches." Behind the injured protests lay a barely concealed threat. If the new masters of Germany had forgotten who had put them into their present lofty position, then there were impatient and embittered SA troopers who could remind them. Hitler was embarrassed. He had always tried to present the Nazis as people who respected institutions, public order, bourgeois morality, and religion. End quote. In February 1934, Hitler tried to solve this obviously approaching implosion by compromise. He passed a law concerning provision for the fighters of the national movement, which offered SA men who had suffered sickness or injury in the political struggle pensions from the state in the same way that those wounded in the First World War would receive. This didn't silence the SA's complaints, and they even got more hostile. As 1934 rolled on, Rome and the SA became openly hostile. Rome made several barely veiled threats and attacked Hitler's allies such as the Conservatives, the army, and just NSDAP leaders in general in frequent speeches. In private meetings with Hitler, Rome would be outright rude and treated him with contempt, frequently reminding him of his humble origins and how much Rome had done to get him into power. On the 6th of August 1933, Rome had come out during an SA parade and declared, quote, "Anyone who thinks that the tasks of the SA have been accomplished will have to get used to the idea that we are here and intend to stay here, come what may." End quote. The SA was a sinking organisation, and in 1934 that fact hadn't changed. They had outlived their usefulness. LePage explains the SA's position leading up to the infamous crisis. Quote, "In the struggle for power, Rome and the SA were becoming increasingly isolated by their more conservative rivals, Hitler and the Nazi Party, the rapidly expanding SS, and the army. Moreover, the moral record of the SA leadership was a stench in the nostrils of all decent Germans. Corruption, brutality, arrogance, debauchery, and perversion were so openly practiced as to be impossible to conceal. Rome and the SA leadership's orgies had long been common knowledge. It was established that they possessed a highly efficient organisation throughout the whole country for the explicit recruiting of a male harem. That these conditions existed could not be, and indeed was not denied. It was also said in Berlin that the greater part of the Winterhilfe charity went into the pockets of the SA leaders to defray the expenses of their luxurious lifestyles. A large part of the German population complained that the SA was an army of occupation." End quote. Among the party leadership, there was demands to deal with the issue. Goering expressed concern at the SA's ambitions to undermine the state. Reich Minister of the Interior, Wilhelm Frick, was sick of the SA's subversive nature. Rudolf Hess was repulsed by the widespread corruption and homosexuality, and took a stand against the SA on moral grounds. All of the industrialists wanted him gone. The Conservatives wanted him gone, the Catholics wanted him gone, the Protestants wanted him gone, but most of all, the army wanted him gone. Rome openly talked without restraint about how he wanted to turn the SA into the one and only German national armed force, and he saw himself as its leader. On the 28th of February, Hitler tried to find a compromise between both sides at an anniversary dinner to celebrate Field Marshal von Schlieffen's birthday. Here, Hitler let it be known that the brown shirts were not suitable for warfare in the context of the army, and that the army was to be the only bearer of arms. He urged the SA not to make difficulties in this regard. Meanwhile, as a compromise, the army offered the SA frontier defense duties, as well as pre-military training, which was actually a huge concession, and could have suited the SA well. Instead of taking any of this on board, Rome was seething with rage. After this, Rome began to take military precautions against the army, and threw mud at Minister of Defense General Blomberg. The tension was almost visible in the air throughout Germany, and there was an increasing number of incidents between the army and SA. For example, on one occasion, an SA man slapped an army officer for refusing to salute their flag. In private, Rome would rage against that ignorant corporal, Hitler. He felt that Hitler had betrayed him, and now he resolved to get what he wanted, with or without Hitler. Rome began to arm his staff guards and stage provocative rallies to show off the SA's strength. Hitler, however, was unwilling to deal with the reality in front of him, and tried to convince Rome to calm down. He said of Rome, quote, "To thank heaven for having given me the right to call you my friend and comrade in arms," end quote. On New Year's Day, he had written to him thanking him for his, quote, "immeasurable services rendered to the National Socialist movement and to the German people," end quote. This all came to no avail, so Hitler gave Rome one last try. On the 4th of June, they met for a one-to-one conversation, in which Hitler begged his old friend to keep in line. Hitler said, quote, "I implored him for the last time to oppose this madness of his own accord, to use his authority to stop a development which in any event could only end in catastrophe," end quote. This too did no good. Hitler felt that this was it. He would have to deal with Rome and his SA by a preventative strike, but still, he wavered. Rome was his oldest friend. Surely, he thought, he could find a peaceful solution, yet none came. Rumours began to swell that Hitler couldn't even control his own party. Elsewhere, Hitler had worries that when Hindenburg passed away, there would be a clamour for the restoration of the monarchy. The leading candidate for the throne was none other than August Wilhelm, who was an honorary SA Gruppenführer. Lepage suggests that Hitler could potentially have been worried about Rome joining forces. After all, Rome was a monarchist at heart. I must add that I've never heard this claim stated anywhere else, however. Also, Vice-Chancellor von Papen was off running his mouth about the current excesses of the National Socialist regime, most of which were perpetrated by the SA. If Hitler were to deal with the SA now, he could deal with several problems at once, and besides, this crisis was inevitably coming to a head. In fact, rumours were now swelling that Rome was actually planning his second revolution imminently, and that he was in close collaboration with the French. Most historians state that this evidence was fabricated by Himmler, Heydrich, and Goering, but what's important is that Hitler actually believed it, and that Hans Bauer, Hitler's pilot, and perhaps the closest man to Hitler, believed it both at the time and decades later when he wrote his memoirs. At the time though, to Hitler, he felt that if anyone was to strike the first blow, it should be him. It was Himmler and his SA that Hitler turned to in order to get the job done, as well as Victor Lutz, an SA man whom had immediately informed Hitler when he caught Rome talking negatively against the Führer and making threats. Hitler told Rome to meet him at the Bad Wiese resort near Munich on the edge of Tegern Lake. Here, Hitler said, they would discuss the future of the SA. Instead, on the 30th of June, the hotel the SA was staying in was personally stormed by the Führer and his SS guards. The Führer was armed with a pistol and personally had Rome arrested. All of the other leaders were quickly rounded up and arrested too. Many were caught in bed with young boys. Some were even caught in the act itself with the boys. The account of the arrest tends to vary slightly. For example, some say Rome was caught in bed with a boy, some say he wasn't on that occasion. It's worth referring to Bauer's memoirs, however, as he repeats what Hitler told him personally. I'll quote it in full, as it's the most coherent of the many confused retellings I've heard. Quote, "Hitler discovered which room Rome was occupying. He went straight up to it and knocked on the door. Rome's voice called out, 'What is it?' 'News from Munich,' Hitler replied. Whereupon, Rome called out again, 'Come in then.' Hitler wrenched the door open, and there, according to his account, lay Rome naked on the bed with a young fellow, also naked. Hitler declared that he had never seen such a revolting sight in his life. He shouted at Rome, 'Get dressed at once, you are under arrest, and I don't need to tell you why.' On recovering a little from his astonishment, and Hitler's unexpected appearance, Rome began to play the innocent, and pretended that he hadn't the faintest idea what Hitler meant. But Hitler cut him short, and turning to the detective with him, he ordered curtly, 'Hogel, see to it that Rome gets dressed, and then bring him downstairs.' Hitler then went from room to room and hauled everyone out of bed, except Rome's doctor, whom he left in peace. All the arrested men were brought down and locked in the cellar until the arrival of transport to take them away. It was only then that Rome's men realized how very few men Hitler had with him. 8 men had carried out the whole action against them. A bus arrived, and the prisoners were bundled into it, guarded by 2 policemen with submachine guns, whilst Hitler drove ahead in his car. He knew that Rome had already ordered his officers to meet him that morning. which meant that they were probably already on their way. So he personally stopped every car they met, offering his apologies to such people as were obviously not concerned in the affair, and allowing them to drive on. But when a car came along with SA officers in it, and there were quite a number of them, he arrested them and put them into the bus with the rest of his prisoners. Only the drivers were left to take the cars back. They also met a lorry with 30 armed SA men. Hitler stopped this lorry too, and told the men they were to go back, as their orders had been cancelled. But the Obersturmführer in charge temporised. He had his orders, and he wanted to obey them. Whereupon, Hitler's adjutant Bruckner shouted at him, "You heard what the Führer said. Obey at once, or I'll shoot you out of hand." The man then got down at pistol point and was loaded in with the others, whilst his men were disarmed and ordered to drive back behind the bus under surveillance. The column moved along the Tegernsee road towards Munich, and as this passes Stadelheim prison, Hitler unloaded them all there. Rome had no intention of killing Hitler, of course. All he had wanted was to push him into the background, but the massacre which crushed the putsch cost 72 men their lives. When Hitler had finished his story, he was still unaware that I had an important detail to contribute, namely, the misunderstanding caused by the fact that we had flown into Munich in a different plane, and not as usual, in the D2600. He listened to what I had to say, and then remarked, "You see, Bauer, the hand of fate was at work there." I had already noticed that Hitler already saw the hand of fate in anything that turned out in his favour. End quote. What Bauer is referring to at the end here is that he arrived at Munich in a different plane than usual. He recounts earlier in the book that the Munich air controller told him that Rome had informed the air controller to immediately contact him if Hitler landed at the airport. Unfortunately for Rome, Hitler arrived in a different plane and immediately sped off. It's also worth noting Hitler's thoughts on the Rome putsch, as noted earlier. Quote, "During dinner, Hitler told me his version of what had happened. It appeared that he had been informed through the Italian ambassador in Paris that his chief of staff, Rome, was preparing a putsch against him. Rome was reported to have got in touch with the French and secured an understanding that in the event of a change of government in Germany, they would take no action. Rome had already drawn up his cabinet list, and his chief aim was now to get his SA incorporated into the army and to secure the dismissal of the old Hohenzollern generals, whom he regarded as unreliable." End quote. Whatever the real story, when all was said and done, the majority of the SA leadership were executed, either at the resort or wherever they could be found all over the country. As for Rome, Hitler actually hesitated to have him killed. Their friendship was too strong. Instead, Rome languished in a prison, whilst those around him persuaded him that it had to be done. Eventually, Hitler relented, and Rome was executed too. Dozens of others died that night as well, but due to the destruction of the records, we aren't sure if this was on the orders of Hitler or Himmler. Old scores were settled left and right. The list of victims is gigantic, but that would steer us off course from this video. Most of the SA fell in line pretty quickly. Clearly, the SA had grown too big, too fast. It simply wasn't organised to deal with such an event. The SA duly handed over their weapon stocks to the army, and reaffirmed their loyalty to the Führer. But what would become of the SA now? The man chosen to replace Rome was none other than Victor Lutz, the one who had informed Hitler of Rome's supposed plans. Lutz had been a hard-working SA man for years. In 1930, he was rewarded for his hard work with a seat in the Reichstag, representing South Hanover. In March 1933, he was appointed police president of Hanover. That same year, he was made a member of the Prussian State Council. What set Lutz apart most of all, though, was simply his opposition to Rome. Lutz felt that the SA leadership was his by right after Pfeffer's departure, and he was livid that Rome, who had been away for years, was able to just suddenly step in and take the spot. Lutz wasn't a particularly colourful man. He did as he was told, and duly did his best for the SA, so in that regard he was the perfect candidate. He had no strange aspirations that would put the state at risk like Rome had, and could be relied on to carry the SA forwards into the new era. One of the first acts in the reorganisation of the SA was to be rid of the ridiculous degeneracy that had filled its ranks beforehand. Hitler told Lutz, quote, "I expect all SA leaders to help to preserve and strengthen the corps in its capacity as a pure and cleanly institution. In particular, I should like every mother to be able to allow her son to join the SA without fear that he may become morally corrupted in their ranks. I want to see men as SA commanders, not ludicrous monkeys." End quote. The SA was now to have its roles reduced in an attempt to have it fit into the new National Socialist state. Men were slowly incorporated into other Nazi organisations, like the Todt organisation, the German Labour Front, or the National Labour Service. Some of the more reliable men were invited to join the army, and a few joined the SS, although most didn't fancy it after recent events. Most of the old bodyguard units were disbanded and reformed into a ceremonial guards regiment. The regiment became a small elite of armed volunteers, which guarded SA's senior officers, as well as some Nazi party buildings and offices. Many of these men ended up joining Kurt Student's paratrooper force, as the army were reluctant to let men go. It was from this initial force of mostly SA men that the infamous parachute regiments from the Second World War were made. All in all, the SA was reduced from a bloated force of 4.5 million men down to a force of 500,000 men. LePage writes, quote, "The once feared and powerful SA organization was completely deprived of political power. The men were relegated to a backseat role, assigned to mundane tasks, and the Corps turned into a veterans association. The days of the radical political bullies had ended with the death of Ernst Röhm and the purging of the radical elements. Never again would the SA be in a position to challenge the German army, the supremacy of the SS, or Hitler's leadership." The SA, now chastened and disarmed, provided a physical manifestation of the power and authority of the Nazi state in public demonstrations, such as the Nuremberg Party Day held in September every year. Until the end of the war, the SA continued to exist as Nazi propagandists, as a sports organisation, and as street fund collectors, but it had been deprived of any real strength. End quote. The SA also played a leading role in charitable organisations, such as the Winter Relief Charity. The charity came about due to the international boycotts against Germany in 1933, which were designed to enforce a kind of starvation blockade, which would kill enough innocent civilians to get Hitler removed from power. The men set about these tasks to help the poorest of German society with joy, and raised a fortune. In the winter of 35-36, the charity raised 31 million Reichsmarks. The SA had finally found a helpful role, which suited the most socialist side of the party, as they had always craved. The SA were also given pre-military training roles, as had been promised before the purge, and they also worked closely with the Hitler Youth and the German Labour Front. During the war, the Todt organisation required protection for their building projects, and from the SA, a defence force was created to do just this. During the war as well, the SA helped out massively on the home front, with anti-aircraft roles and police duties. In the lead up to the war, an SA force was created in Danzig as a kind of low-key frontier defence unit. The Poles were constantly committing atrocities, and the defence of the innocents in Danzig fell to these SA men. This unit is the one that famously captured the post office in Danzig when war broke out. After this, the SA's numbers were depleted further, as obviously men were needed for the front. From then on, its ranks were mostly filled with older men, disabled men, or those unfit for regular military service. In 1943, Lutz died in a car crash outside Berlin and was replaced by Wilhelm Scheppmann. In 1944, the SA were heavily involved with the Volkssturm, despite Bormann's best efforts to keep them out. Of all people, Franz Pfeffer actually re-emerged to take command of a Volkssturm brigade near the Swiss border. It's also worth noting the attitude of the men after the purge, as obviously, many didn't want to take this laying down. The SA became the go-to organisation for anyone seeking assistance against the SS. Himmler was primarily blamed for their downfall. In May 1938, after the Blomberg and Fritsch affair, the anti-Nazi General Ulex asked Lutz about the SA's attitude in the event of Wehrmacht action against the SS. Lutz replied that the SA would be, quote, "unconditionally at your side," end quote. As the SS became far more excessively violent than the SA had ever been, it was the SA who were brought in to stop them during the war. Alfred Rosenberg, the Minister for the Eastern Occupied Territories, and the SA together took up their cudgels against excessive SS influence in the occupied territories. Von Ribbentrop would deliberately fill embassy and foreign legation posts with SA leaders who had survived the Rome purge to cancel out Himmler's foreign policy plans. To fix these poor relations between the SA and the SS, Hitler had an SS division named after the SA's greatest martyr, Horst Wessel. Few SA men chose to join the unit, however, and SA men joining the SS was rare. The damage had already been done, and the tables had in fact now flipped. It was the SS who were excessive and far above their station now, and the SA who were viewed with sympathy by many areas of the party. With the war, however, the growth of the SS could never be quelled, and Hitler had to essentially give Himmler a free hand. In hindsight, the purge was a completely avoidable situation. The SA clearly had to reorganize itself and find a new purpose after the seizure of power. It was never going to be the same once they got in. Instead of adjusting to life under the new regime, they became a liability. Rome pushed for a political army, and the army joined forces with the SS to stop him. What the army got for their trouble was the rise of the SS, which resulted in a far more brutal and actually organised political army that ended up coexisting alongside their own, which they were in general morally repulsed by. Regardless, Rome had to be stopped for his sick crimes against children on an industrial scale, and it was he who refused to adapt to the new Germany and began to provoke an inevitable crisis. Whether his second revolution was real or not is neither here nor there. His removal was both inevitable and needed for a variety of reasons. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please do consider leaving a like and sharing the video. It helps immensely. As always though, the biggest thank you of all goes to my Patreon, Subscribe Star and YouTube members who make these videos possible. Without their kind donations, I simply wouldn't be able to do this for a living, and I can't thank them enough. If you do want to support the channel, join our Discord, or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, then please do consider clicking one of the links in the description. Even the $2 tier helps immensely. Thank you. Thank you to Lobster2U, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsok, Anton Bergland, Levi E, Friendly Brian, Mr. Malabar, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, Henry Unruh, Evan Brightfield, Chef Jeff, Ethan Winstanley, Wunderwaffe, Mr. Bloom, Gav D, Gaiz Longanese Hanno, JD, Green Rebel, Angus Roxburgh, Rocksaka Too Heavy, Alexios Podcast Watcher, Citadel, Haste, Bojan M, Rick Me, Mr. Gaming, Cameron, Sludwig 1919, Gloomy, Troy Harser, Jagdkampf, Rowan, Swedish Chef, Honda, Mirko, David Byers, Max Anton, Gragas, Conqueror, Espen, Khan, Luka Marincic, Veritas Unleashed, The Real G, Joel, Ghost 0128, Jack, Bobby Atkinson, John DeGrief, Ward, Crankless, Dramatic Equation, Russ Hale, Senator Armstrong, Lucas Drury, Mark Smith, Shameful Display, Sneed Seed and Feed, Bruno, Emma Magishmael, William S., Ozzy Mandias, Sword Dog, Aussie Ones, Prada, Aussie Zuma, Joe Ford, Jive Ginseng, Mr. Toad, Leigh Agnew, Carolyn J, Alex D, Violently Normal, Brendan Stout, K. Reich, Unlikely Balmer, Enclave, Welcome to Kali Yuga, The Old Vault, Justin F, Lane Perkins, King Fried Chicken, Rene Melmgren, Gianni Rabati, Panzer Jim, Aopa Ahola, Laudel, Hans, Chris, Jordan Troy, Jihad Gandalf, It's Okay to Be a Nationalist, Inflection Point, Vet Exempt, Automat 762X39, Monsoir Mercier, Charlie Black, Will from Florida, History by Grayscale, The Waller, Suma Klubayek, Jorgen 1997, Admiral Kempinski, Carl Jung, and James Ferris. Blimey, that was